You know how sometimes things seem stable, predictable, and then, bam, everything changes.
Yeah, like pulling the rug out.
Exactly. And that might be happening right now with the U.S. approach to the Russia-Ukraine peace talks.
Right.
We're hearing it could shift drastically, like within days.
It's quite startling, isn't it? The speed. We've been watching the diplomatic dance, but this sudden acceleration from the U.S., well, it could signal a really fundamental rethink of their strategy.
Totally. And for this deep dive, we've got some really interesting material, news reports, different perspectives, a peek at online chatter, and crucially, a new U.S. public opinion survey.
A good mix.
So our goal today is to really get into this potential U.S. pivot. Why this sudden rush? What happens next?
Yeah.
And how are people seeing this, both here and in Europe?
Sounds good.
Okay, let's start with that urgency. The timeline they're talking about feels incredibly short.
It really does. Secretary of State Marco Rubio, he's been pretty blunt about it. He said they need clear signs of a workable peace path within the next few weeks.
Right, but the decision to even keep trying, that's the kicker.
Exactly. He put a time frame on that decision.
He actually said, we're not going to continue with this endeavor for weeks and months on end. So we need to determine very quickly now, and I'm talking about a matter of days, whether or not this is doable in the next few weeks.
Days to decide whether to proceed on something this huge.
Wow. Trying to wrap up years of conflict in weeks and deciding if it's worth the effort in mere days.
Yeah. And Rubio also hinted, didn't he, that President Trump might just pull the plug soon if there's no major progress. Like, well, we're done.
Mm-hmm. That definitely creates a sense of a looming deadline.
And they seem to feel they've already put in a lot of work fast.
Oh, yeah. Rubio claimed, we've done more in 80 days than Biden ever did to bring this war to an end.
One bold claim.
And also that the president spent almost the entirety of the president's first 100 days in office on this. Big assertions about their engagement level.
It is. It pushes their narrative, right? Swift, decisive action. Whether you agree or not, the point for us is they feel they've invested a lot and now they want results quickly.
So, okay, the desire for peace is there, but it feels very U.S.-centric in its urgency. What's the underlying American perspective here, based on the sources?
Well, Rubio's framing is quite telling. He stated quite clearly, I think it's important to remind everybody that the Ukraine war is a terrible thing, but it's not our war. We didn't start it. The United States has been helping Ukraine over the last 3 years, and we want it to end, but it's not our war. I want everyone to understand that.
Not our war. That's a very specific framing.
It is. It suggests maybe a shift, less about global responsibility, perhaps more about domestic focus.
Yeah.
A bit more transactional, maybe.
Definitely different from some past approaches.
And he doubled down, right?
Yeah.
Mentioned other priorities.
Yep. He said there are a lot of things going on in the world right now that we need to be focused on. So this is important, but there are a lot of other really important things going on that deserve just as much, if not more, attention. Okay, so for listeners, it seems the administration is weighing Ukraine against, well, everything else on their plate.
Precisely. Which feeds back into that idea that their commitment might depend on getting a fast win so they can move on.
Right. Okay, so we get the urgency, the U.S. viewpoint, but they have been involved diplomatically, yeah. What about the actual engagement? Any kind of peace plan on the table?
Yes, absolutely. Sources say Ambassador Wickoff met with Putin multiple times, and there have been, quote, repeated engagements with the Ukrainians, too.
Okay.
And Rubio mentioned this broad framework they've floated. Put it in front of Ukraine, key European allies, Russia.
A broad framework.
Right?
What does they usually mean in diplo speak? General ideas.
Pretty much. Likely outlines the main principles, potential pathways, but leaves the tricky details for negotiation, not the finished article.
And why keep the details under wraps?
Rubio was clear on that. He said, I'm not going to tell you what the framework says, because when you start negotiating these things through the media and so forth, they fall apart. Standard practice, really. Keep it confidential to allow for actual negotiation without public posturing.
Makes sense. Avoids things getting shot down before they even start.
Yeah.
So how does this framework land? What was the initial reaction?
Rubio called it encouraging. He also said nobody rejected anything, nobody got up from the table and walked away.
Encouraging is a bit vague.
It is, but nobody rejected anything suggests at least people were willing to listen, maybe an opening, even if not full agreement.
A tentative positive, perhaps. But the U.S. isn't alone here. What about the Europeans? How are they involved, and what do they make of this U.S. rush?
Yeah, that's where it gets complicated. The U.S. knows they need the Europeans, UK, France, Germany. Rubio called their input in the Paris talks very constructive and very helpful.
And they have to be involved, right?
Yeah.
Because of the sanctions.
Exactly. Rubio pointed that out. Part of the sanctions against Russia, many of them are European sanctions that we can't lift if we're ever to be part of a deal. So they're going to have to be involved no matter what. Lifting those needs European unity. Big economic leverage.
Okay, so Europe's essential.
Yeah.
But are they totally on board with the U.S. speed here? Our sources hinted at some friction.
Yeah, definitely. Reports mention shock and dismay in some European capitals about the U.S. position, worries about appeasement?
Appeasement, strong word.
And a feeling maybe of being left out of the loop initially. It points to maybe different priorities, different strategic patience levels.
Right.
U.S. wants speed. Maybe Europe wants more consensus.
Sounds like Europe might feel a bit blindsided. So what are they thinking? If the U.S. does step back, what's plan B for Europe?
Well, there seems to be a growing sense in Europe that they need to step up more on Ukraine's defense. You see the Baltic states calling for more European defense spending, pushing Ukraine's EU membership path.
But not everyone agrees on how.
Right. Italy, for instance, apparently poured cold water on sending European troops, calling it the most complex and least effective way to keep peace.
Interesting. And Germany, they're key. Big economy, big supporter of Ukraine, but also historically reliant on the U.S. security-wise.
Germany's in a tough spot. They rely on the U.S., their own military revamp, the Zeitenwende, has hit some bumps. But they are Europe's biggest donor to Ukraine, militarily and financially.
And what about German public opinion?
Interestingly, a recent poll there showed slightly more support than opposition for Germans participating in some kind of peace enforcement mission, so maybe a cautious willingness to do more.
Wow. So a real mix of reactions across Europe. Okay,
Yeah.
Stepping back from the diplomacy, what are the actual core issues stopping a deal? The fundamental sticking points between Russia and Ukraine?
The sources spell them out pretty starkly. Russia wants Ukraine to ditch NATO ambitions, give up the territory Russia occupies, and drastically shrink its army.
And Ukraine sees that as
Basically tantamount to demanding its capitulation, understandably.
Yeah. I mean, the gap between those positions seems enormous.
It really is, which makes that U.S. timeline, well, it makes it seem even more challenging, doesn't it?
It absolutely does.
Yeah.
Now, there was something else in the sources that caught my eye. This U.S.-Ukraine minerals deal. What's that about? And how does it fit in?
Right. That's a fascinating angle. Reports suggest progress on this deal, giving the U.S. access to Ukraine's significant mineral resources, like rare earths and lithium. President Trump even confirmed it, said, "We have a minerals deal." Ukraine apparently signed a memorandum of intent.
And the timing. Is it connected to the peace push?
Well, there's speculation. Some suggest it might be linked to Trump's drive for settlement, maybe even seen as a way for the U.S. to sort of recoup its massive military aid investment in Ukraine.
So the economic interest might be tangled up with the diplomatic urgency.
It's certainly a plausible factor to consider. The timing raises questions, How much are economic goals driving the diplomatic timetable? It adds another layer of complexity.
It definitely does. Okay, let's shift back home. What about the American public? What does that opinion poll tell us about how people here feel about potential peace terms?
The Chicago Council Ipsos poll gives us some really good insights. There's strong support, a majority, for an immediate ceasefire and prisoner exchange. Those seem like points of general agreement.
Okay, common ground there. But what about the tougher issues?
That's where it gets divided. On Russia keeping Crimea, public opinion is split. 38% say acceptable, 31% unacceptable. Much stronger opposition, though, to Russia keeping all the territory it currently occupies. Only 19% find that acceptable, 58% say unacceptable.
Big difference there. And what about Ukraine giving up on NATO?
That shows a clear partisan split. Overall, 38% find it acceptable, but Republicans are significantly more willing to accept that condition than Democrats are.
That partisan divide seems like a recurring theme in U.S. foreign policy debates. What about lifting sanctions on Russia or sending troops?
On sanctions, slightly more Americans find lifting them unacceptable, 39%, than acceptable, 33%. Not a huge margin, but leaning against it. And sending U.S. or NATO troops, either to defend Ukraine or enforce peace, Democrats are much more supportive of that than Republicans.
Interesting.
But one area of consensus. Across party lines, a majority wants the U.S., the EU, Russia, and Ukraine all involved in peace talks.
So yeah, a real patchwork of views domestically. No easy answers on what Americans want in a deal. Okay, let's gang this out a bit. If the U.S. did pull back significantly from these peace efforts, What would the global fallout look like?
Well, the immediate impact. Probably weaker chances for a negotiated peace. The U.S. has unique leverage, right, with both sides. If they step back, who fills that void?
So more pressure on Europe.
Almost certainly. Europe would likely feel compelled to take a much more direct leading role. More diplomacy, more financial aid, maybe even more responsibility for Ukraine's security itself.
And for Ukraine, the risks if U.S. support wanes.
Potentially huge, they could be more vulnerable. Russia might feel less pressure to compromise without the U.S. pushing hard. And things like future security guarantees for Ukraine. Much harder to figure out without the U.S. at the table.
And zooming out further, wider global implications.
A U.S. disengagement could signal a bigger shift in Trump's foreign policy, more uncertainty about U.S. commitments globally. Other countries might start reassessing their alliances.
Strain on the U.S.-Europe relationship, too.
Potentially, yeah. Especially if the U.S. withdraws without really coordinating with European allies. It could also, damage the U.S. reputation as a reliable partner.
And what about that minerals deal we talked about?
Its future would become uncertain, too, presumably, if the diplomatic context changes drastically. Lots of potential ripple effects.
Really sounds like it. Before we wrap up, you mentioned seeing some online reactions, like on Reddit. What's the chatter like there?
Oh, Reddit. It's varied and passionate. On World News, for instance, you see skepticism about past Western predictions, lots of blaming Putin, naturally. Then there's debate about Trump's actual ability to make peace.
And the minerals deal.
Yeah, lots of different takes on that rare earth deal. Some see it as the main reason for U.S. involvement, or even for a potential quick exit. You still see arguments about who started the war, Russia's economic state. Some cynicism, too, like the U.S. got the deal and now they're checking out.
So a microcosm of the broader confusion and strong opinions.
Pretty much. It shows just how complex public perception is.
Okay, so let's try to boil this down. Key takeaways from our deep dive today.
I think the main thing is this clear signal from the U.S. about a very short fuse for progress on Ukraine peace talks. It seems driven by President Trump's focus on quick results and other priorities.
Right, and this potential shift has huge implications.
Massive. For Ukraine's security, for Europe potentially having to step up significantly, and for the whole direction of U.S. foreign policy, how committed is it to sticking with tough global problems?
And the actual chance of a quick, lasting peace deal still seems incredibly uncertain given how far apart Russia and Ukraine are.
Absolutely. The core disagreements are fundamental. And what role Europe could or would play if the U.S. pulls back? That's a huge question mark.
Definitely. Which leaves us with a final thought, maybe a provocative one for everyone listening. With such a tight deadline and such deep divisions, is a quick, lasting peace even realistic?
Or is the U.S. basically preparing the ground to change its involvement level, regardless of the human cost or the geopolitical fallout?
What does this whole episode tell us about international diplomacy, about the priorities of big powers here in 2025? Something to chew on.